You asked me about to deal with the issues and topics I've dealt with, so maybe I'll just say a few more things about the social life of, about the book, Life Live Like a Story. Again, my interest really was in ethnographic writing, and that core puzzle I've already discussed was that how to do work that sort of fit into some kind of community framework. The younger women I was working with were less disturbed than I was about the fact that these booklets that we were preparing for families would sometimes have 9, 10 pages of something that might look like family history, and then maybe 100 pages of stories, and I was not sure that I was actually doing what was expected of me, but no, that seemed to be fine. People didn't object to that too much. And it was, again, I would start asking someone about, can you remember when you were a little girl and such happened? And she would say, essentially, not in these words, but it was sort of, when you know enough to ask the right questions, maybe we can get to that. But in the meantime, this is what you're going to do. Write down this story. And this went on long enough that I learned that was really the direction they were taking. The book that followed that was, and this actually happened when I was already just starting teaching at UBC. A group of people in the Yukon put together a committee to try and develop some curriculum materials that would be suitable for grade 12 high school curriculum. And they established a committee of elders, a committee of teachers, and community members who were interested in education. And we worked together on that project, which became a book called Reading Voices. It was brilliantly put together by Robert Bringhurst, who is a wonderful editor and writer, but he was able to make it into a really important book, I think, it still has some relevance in the Yukon, I think, looking at different forms of history. This led me then to some other questions, though, because again, one of the questions you asked was about the social lives of these stories. I put together a book that was really a revision of a number of articles that I've been thinking about over the years, some of them published, some of them not, about the social life of stories. And what I meant by that really was that these stories, once told, women were able to show how they could be used in different contexts. Probably the best example of that, and I'll give you several examples because I also think they reflected back on anthropological theory and make some really important contributions to that. But in one case, Mrs. Angela Sidney told me a story about a man named Kakachgook, who was from the coast, but part of a group very closely related to her own community. And something had happened in the past when there had been a disagreement, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The story was basically that this man, Kakachgook, had gone out with his nephews. In a matrilineal society, one always took one's nephews, had gone out hunting and heard something that disturbed him. He heard a seal's cry, and he knew that meant that this was very bad luck and that he shouldn't continue, he should go back home. So he went back to shore, he destroyed his spears, he didn't go out fishing again, but eventually it became just intolerable to him that his family, his wives and their children had to beg for food from other people because he wasn't able to support them. So once again he gathered his nephews together, got the canoes and ready, and they went out again. And sure enough, they were lost in a storm, completely lost and turned around. And they drifted for a while, and then they came to an island where he managed to help them survive for a year by finding ways to get fresh water, food, and whatever. And at the same time, he made a very clear choice about how he was going to try to get back home. He established a kind of line. He made a stake in the ground where he could see where the sun was. And when it got to a certain point, and he knew it was equinox, he realized he could direct himself back home, and came back much to the surprise of everyone and to the absolute delight of his family, who thought that they'd never see any of them again. And that was a story that Mrs. Sidney recorded, and it was one of our first little booklets, which went out to schools, a little booklet called My Stories Are My Wealth, which different women had contributed to. That was a phrase by Mrs. Sidney, by the way, which I think made her point. My stories are my wealth. She said, I have no money to leave to my grandchildren, but these are my stories. But then she wanted, about 10 years later, she wanted to talk about this story again. Her son, Peter, and his wife, Kay, were visiting one day, and she started to talk about how difficult it had been for her, when he went off to war. He and his brother, she had 2 sons who went off in 1940s to the Second World War, as did many Aboriginal men from the Yukon. And they never knew whether they would be back or what would happen. And she talked about how she got a telegram from him saying, booked for Canada, tomorrow I'm coming. This was after years. And she was astounded. And they got a map, and they calculated how long it would take to cross Canada on the train, and how long it would take to catch the ferry, which was then running up to Alaska, and then how long it would take to get the little train, the White Pass and Yukon train to Carcross, where she was living. And she said to her husband, I really want to do something about this. I want to give him a gift. And I've decided that the gift I'm going to give him is this Kakachkuk song, because it's the same as the man as Kakachkuk. He went away and they didn't know what would happen, and he was able to find his way home. And her husband was very proud of her and said, that's very smart. I didn't know you were that smart, he said. She was proud to say this. But then she said her uncles immediately jumped in and said, you can't do that. That song does not belong to you. It belongs to another clan. It belongs to a clan of people, and you're not allowed to do that. And so she said she set out to do her research, and she went down to the coast, and she talked to various people who talked about, yes, there had been a dispute between her Deshitan clan and another clan that escalated, and finally they had decided to resolve it with a very important story, with an exchange of a story. The story was part of the reconciliation, and it was given, she said, to her clan. So when her son came home, they had a big feast for him, and she sang that song. And that was, while contested at the time, that became an important gift for her to talk about. So the social life of stories, I mean, the point of that being that these stories aren't just written down as kind of things that appeared from the past, as a kind of a record taking. They actually have a real life in the future. And more, I found this in many of the other projects that I was working on too. Another thing that struck me was women talking about prophecies. There were many people talked about things that were happening from the Alaska Highway construction onward that had been prophesied earlier. The time I was really aware of this was during the pipeline hearings, when the Alaska Highway pipeline was being discussed by the National Energy Board and by the Lissick inquiry. And a young man stood up and talked about a story that he had heard about a prophet who had predicted that this would happen and that it would cause great trouble to people in this area. So I got interested in the whole notion because there were so many prophecies people talked about. And if you go to the academic literature, you find Weber and others talk about prophets as being people who arise at difficult times in history. They're often people who are unusual, who aren't quite central to their society, but they're able to somehow do something that makes some sort of a contribution. I know I'm paraphrasing this badly, but the idea that it's an exceptional event. And from in these women's stories, prophecy was not an exceptional event. It was an example of someone who was really able to sort of follow certain kinds of protocols and understand how to gain particular powers. And so I thought that was an interesting point to be made. One of the things that comes from working with the agenda of the people with whom you're working, rather than deciding that you're going to study a particular institution. Second example of that was the gold rush, because when I first came to the Yukon, the literature you could find about the Yukon was all about the gold rush. It's 1896, there was a tremendous depression. People came from all over the world. Gold was found in the Yukon. There was a person who was credited, a person named Robert Henderson, I believe the name was, credited with finding gold. People came, and in fact, thousands of people came to the Yukon Territory, passing through the land of all these people. They came down the river. They rarely mentioned Aboriginal people, but Aboriginal people certainly saw them and had lots to say about what was going on. But the stories that I heard were from people in the communities, these same women, about a man named Skookum Jim, who was actually present at the discovery of gold. I won't go through all the details of the stories, but they showed how people locally had been involved in the discovery of gold. There is a lot written about this now, but there hadn't been before. Kate Carmack was married to a prospector. She was a local woman, a Tagish woman. She was married to a prospector who went down the river, and she and her family were there. Skookum Jim, Keish, his name is in the language, was responsible in a matrilineal society for his sisters. So the whole story is really about how indigenous people found gold, and then there was everything else followed. But those were not the kinds of stories. You got the kind of heroic notion of Skookum Jim in Pierre Burton's book, who speaks of him as a giant of a man who really wanted to be a white man. There's no indication of where that ever came from, but it fits perfectly the myth of the gold rush seeker and the Western myth of the time. So all these stories could get inverted and turned around historically. There was also a very tragic story about two prospectors who were killed. 4 Indigenous men were charged and taken and tried for murder in Dawson City. But if you hear the story from the local community, it had to do with prospectors who left arsenic around, and some people made some bread with that, and some people died, and then the Indigenous people understood the prospectors to be part of a clan in the same way that they were, so they were waiting for retribution, or they were waiting for restitution, I should have said, that somehow this would be made properly acknowledged. And when it wasn't, someone was shot, and this continued to be a very complicated story. There's a playwright in the Yukon, an Indigenous playwright, who's written a play about this, which was performed a couple of years ago, that looks at it from this angle too. So these stories don't just add to history, they challenge historical accounts that we have in the record. I think was part of my interest in how many of these stories appeared. There was another story that turned up over and over and over again in narratives about stolen women, women who something would happen and they'd be taken away, and then there'd be a question of whether they could return or not. This is Richard Slobodin, I believe, wrote about this earlier too, years ago. But the stories that the women told were really about how those women who were stolen managed to somehow get back home. And inevitably, not always, but most times, if they behaved in particular ways that they've been trained to do things, they would be able to come back to their maternal home. In matrilineal society, that's really important. And the larger picture, I mean, there are many, many of these stories, but the larger picture that they were trying to paint is young women need to know these stories now. These aren't just stories from the past. They have enormous impact on how young women should learn to think and be able to behave and lead lives that they can be happy with. The Storytelling Festival was another example that I'll just mention because I found it interesting. It was started in the 1980s, and I'm not too sure exactly the year. A young woman, Louise Prophet LeBlanc, Indigenous woman who's was very central in getting this started, had a lot to do with this. And she said that the inspiration was Angela Sidney, one of these women who I'd worked with so closely. And it was a wonderful event that happened in a park in Whitehorse. And I was quite aware that it was happening in the same area. If you'll remember, I talked about someone named Jim Lotz, who was the first person to introduce me to the Yukon. He'd written stories about how squatters, people designated as squatters, had been removed from the place that was this park. And just one of the many stories that I found very interesting was told by a woman named Jessie Scarf, who I'd known her since I first went to the Yukon. She was a remarkably astute person. And I think what she was saying was, here we are in a situation where we have a large audience, and this is a story that can be told that not everybody will necessarily like, but they might need to understand it. This also was following just in the period when land claims was being settled. But she began by talking, and she was in her 70s at the time, about how she'd been doing some research in the archives, which was made to be a joke, as if she would have to do research in the archives because she'd lived all this. And then talked systematically about how people had been removed from the area where we all were all sitting in the middle of a festival. And I thought that was extremely interesting. There were other people doing similar kinds of things. It gave Aboriginal people, First Nations, men and women, a chance to tell stories to an audience in a way that would tweak the way those stories might be heard, and those stories probably hadn't been heard before. So I found that the Storytelling Festival, I thought, was wonderful for that. It was also a truly international storytelling festival. People came from Greenland and from Alaska and from the circumpolar north. It was wonderful. It's been there. It hasn't continued, but there are new festivals and new similar kinds of events that go on in the Yukon all the time. And I think often these tensions that may have existed can be addressed by stories from the past that put a different light on things, certainly as those women were very intent to do. The final one I'll just mention that's also in that book, a story, Mrs. Kitty Smith was one of the women I worked with closely. This is the notion of objects in museums. And I was, at that point, thinking about this a lot because the Museum of Anthropology, as you know, is a remarkable institution and very beautiful works there that people come to see from around the world. But I got interested in what happens to these less classically artistic, but nevertheless important objects that might not necessarily be in a museum like the Museum of Anthropology. And one was a little carving that was found by by Louise Prophet-LeBlanc, actually, I think, and a couple of other people who noticed and thought that it might have been a carving made by Kitty Smith, one of the women I've been working with. So they took her and she said, oh yes, and she talked about the story. But when she told me about it, she talked about how as a young woman, she was orphaned. Her parents, her father died, and then her mother was called home. She'd come from another community in relation to this story I mentioned earlier about when there were some deaths of people and some men were charged with, Native men were charged and tried in Dawson City. Her mother was a brother of one of these men, and so she'd gone. So Mrs. Smith actually grew up in her sense, almost as an orphan. For a while, she stayed with her father's family, which was not usual. Usually be with your mother's family, but and only later in her life, as an adult, did she move to her grandmother's territory. But she talked about how she, when she was having difficulties in life, she would sit and just start carving, and she'd carve away at something that represented some story that she'd known from the past. And one of these was the story of an orphan who had been in terrible difficulty and had to go through a number of trials and eventually was able to save a large number of people. This is a story that is shown on beautiful totem poles on the coast. You would see lots of representations of it in museums, but you might miss Mrs. Smith's representation of this. And yet it was, the process of making that was a process for her of thinking about her own life in a way. And I think we sometimes divide art and non-art in ways that, maybe there are justifications, but there are other ways of thinking about these things. So I became very interested in these small, maybe not so much known art objects that are important in the Yukon, I might say. Her work is now very much recognized in the Yukon. Frédéric, you asked me at one point about oral history and anthropology and how they were similar and how they were different. And it's interesting, there was a panel this year, 2016, at CASCA on that very issue that I was very lucky to be invited to be a part of it. Amy Starczewski from Columbia organized the panel, and there were a number of questions about this. What's oral history and what do oral historians do and what do anthropologists do, and is it different and how is it different? And it strikes me, and I think this is probably an oversimplification, there were lots of suggestions there, but it seems to me that oral history in a way is looking for trying to correct or write the historical record or somehow contribute to what really happened is the question there. Can we get at that? And maybe that's part of the story of the men who were tried on trial in Dawson City. The stories people tell really gets back to what really happened. But there are other stories that I think are more like, how do people remember, and what's remembered and what's significant for whom. And so I think that the narrative studies in anthropology are often more in that area. But I do think these are two disciplines that are coming together in different ways. I became very interested in oral history in Europe, particularly stories of post-war Europe and what happens with memory there. And you, this is another jump, but you did ask about the work that I'd done in Siberia at one point, and this falls very much into that category. When I was on sabbatical in Cambridge one year, I met Tatiana Argonova, a young woman, a Saha young woman from Siberia. Saha people used to be called Yakut, and now the term is for their nation is Saha. And she was a PhD student and was trying to do research on the history of what happened to Saha writers and poets during the Stalinist years. Saha people are a large group, and they had a written language, and they did have artists and writers and poets, and do continue to have very much. So we went to, she asked if I'd come because I'd had some experience with oral history. Really, that was the whole project. And we worked together interviewing people, artists and elders, who wanted to recount those particular times and the difficulties of those particular times, and the lives that were lost as a result of what was then called bourgeois nationalism. If you referred to your ethnicity, for instance, as Saha, it could have been very dangerous at certain points. And we worked together for, I went a couple of times with her, and it was interesting. You asked what the comparisons were, and they're not comparisons really so much with the kinds of stories. Tatiana also came to the Yukon one year, so we discussed this very often with elders in both places. The question that I think what became important to me with this is, what's the difference of oral history being told in a liberal democracy compared with stories that are told in a place where telling your story could have been at one point punishable by death? And that was really the whole idea. People in that area of Saha Republic were feeling confident now to sort of start telling the stories of their past. At the time I was first there, the governor was considered to be Saha and Russian both. He had family members on both sides of that. That's changed a little bit since then, but people were feeling a sense that they could continue to talk about this. Tatiana's continued to do a lot of work. She's now doing work with a colleague, Alison Brown, and they've been working with people at the British Museum. There are objects that have come, small objects that have come to the British Museum from that part of the world, and so they've been taking them back, rather like Mrs. Kitty Smith's carvings, getting recognition and seen in their own communities. That's what's been happening there. So it's been interesting to talk with her about all of these things. It is a time in the Yukon when oral history is something that people can talk about a whole lot. There are, of course, lots of places in the world where you can't. So that's very interesting as well, I think. Ethnohistory, yes. I'll just say one thing because should I stop? 5 minutes before you asked me about ethnohistory too. I appreciate all these questions because they brought all these questions to my mind when I was thinking about this. I found the Ethnohistory Society remarkably helpful to me in terms of all my thinking when I was a graduate student and afterward. They have small meetings. I do like small meetings rather than these very large ones. And like CASCA, the Canadian Anthropology Society, I think ethnohistory was interesting. I wonder about this term and what it really means, because I think it has different meaning to different people, but it gave me a place to sort of think about and talk about the contributions of oral history from communities, small communities in the North who have very definite memories and ideas and interpretations of events that might be talked about quite differently in written history books at the time.